Let me start with you, Dr. Celia. Again, the question I heard somebody ask over the weekend is whether France now has its own Afghanistan.
No, I don't think France has its own Afghanistan. I think for a variety of reasons, we are faced with a long-term problem in North Africa, a problem that has its origins in the original campaigns in Afghanistan, because originally with the U.S. fight against the Russians in Afghanistan years ago, that's where the first wave of Mujahideen fighters left from Algeria and other places to go and fight in Afghanistan, eventually came back, and we've had these waves of combatants coming, radical combatants coming from Africa, going to Afghanistan, coming back. That's where the problems originally started, but we can go forward and backward and blame one another. The reality is that we have an escalating challenge in North Africa, in Mali. And the international community, including Africa, needs probably to stand together in dealing with this challenge. It is, as David Cameron said, going to be with us for a long time. And the challenge that we face is if sometimes urgent interventions are required to deal with urgent issues, and that's the situation that I think we had particularly with the French intervention of a few days ago.
Let's narrow it down, if we may, here, Dr. Celia, because define for us the nature of this challenge. Who are these Islamists, as they are called, and why are they called Islamists?
Africa is a very religious continent. 9 out of 10 Africans believe that religion is either important or very important in their lives. A Pew survey that was done a while ago indicated that, as a whole, Africans are as religious generally as Pakistan, and we consider Pakistan to be a country full of extremely religious people, very convinced of their views of the world. Now, the difference between Pakistan, Afghanistan, these areas, and Africa is that particularly Saudi Arabia invested hundreds of millions of dollars over the years in building the madrasas, in building up a very radical view of Islam in particular. This is not the situation in Africa, but we have a continent that with a lot of young people, a continent that is extremely poor, and people that are very aware of their relative deprivation. So the first point to make is that there are the basis is there, the root causes are there for challenges. So that's the first. The next step in our analysis would then be to look more closely at the identity of the various groups that are, for example, involved in Mali and elsewhere. And these can be divided into various factions. There's the Tuaregs, which are really indigenous Africans that have been fighting for years for their independence. There are the infusion of radicals that I've spoken about that come from that have been building up for many years, and there are then the vast majority of ordinary Africans that are abused and accused by all concerned. And maybe the final grouping are the African governments, which are often corrupt and trying to democratize and trying to move forward, but often facing very challenging positions. So that, in very short terms, is the sort of the root causes issues, religion, poverty, and so on, and a view of some of the main active groupings in North Africa.
It's such a complex thing. It's not just a straightforward good over evil issue, because you're raising, for instance, the issue of Islam. Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian wrote about this last week, and he said, actually, Mali is the 8th country in the last 4 years in which Western powers have bombed and killed Muslims, after Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, and the Philippines. That makes it complex, doesn't it, Dr. Celia?
Yes, and foreign intervention has a decidedly mixed history of success. We know from Somalia, from Afghanistan, that external intervention rarely succeeds. And should be avoided. So there's absolutely no doubt about the fact that unilateral external intervention is a bad thing. But what we have now in Mali is we had a crisis situation. And France was quite careful, I think, contrary maybe to other instances previously, to make sure that it had the support of ECOWAS. It had the support of the international community before engaging. And what needs to happen in Mali, of course, is that the French, this needs to become an African operation as quickly as possible. The French went in because unfortunately, the African standby force, which is supposed to be able to do this, just couldn't. And had the France not gone in, I'm afraid that Bamako may have fallen. If that was the case, the situation would have been that you would have to have a very complex engagement to try and re-exert control over Mali. And you would then have had Mali that could have, in a sense, infected the whole West Africa region. So the situation, in my view, was quite urgent. And in this instance, I think that, unfortunately, bad as external international engagement may be, much as we would not like that, particularly in Africa, given our history, this was probably the only option that was left on the table.
All right. Do you agree with that, Tom Wheeler? Was it the only option? How big a threat are these Islamists, not only to Mali and Algeria, but also to North Africa as a whole and the West?
Well, I think, yes, I do agree. You know, the UN Security Council had approved an African force going into Mali, arranged by ECOWAS, the Economic Commission of West African States, led by Nigeria. And quite a number of the states from that particular region had forces that were to go in. But the target date was only set for September, whereas the crisis originated last week. And when this sudden surge from the north of Mali, which is rather isolated from the south, where Bamako, the capital, is, the surge south was coming so quickly that there was no way of waiting until September for this other force to come onto the scene. And the French decided the only thing to do was to launch first a bombing campaign and then to put people and equipment on the ground in support of the Mali army to try and fend off this jihadist insurgency from the north.
Alex, do you agree with that? Because I've read some analysts who are saying that the intervention by France was really nothing more or nothing less than militarism or neo-colonialism.
No, I agree that this is a very special situation, that if there hadn't been a French intervention just over a week ago, there would have probably been a jihadist takeover of Bamako. The Malian military is very inefficient. It could not have stopped the onslaught that the jihadists were planning, and the Malian government basically asked the French to intervene. So this was the least worst option that there was. Bear in mind that there was another crisis last year in the Central African Republic, and France there said, no, we're not going to intervene. That's got to be led by Africans. And so you had the Economic Community of Central African States and indeed South Africa engaging in Central African Republic. So again, I think France's role has changed, and it's only because of the severity of the situation that there was no other option. Nobody else could intervene quickly. And the existential threat both to Africa as well as to Europe was such that France moved so quickly.
It's interesting you say that, but let me quote Owen Jones in The Independent last week, and you may have seen this, Alex. He said, this intervention is itself the consequence of another. The Libyan war is frequently touted as a success story for liberal interventionism, yet the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi's dictatorship had consequences that Western intelligence services probably never even bothered to imagine. Tuaregs, who traditionally hailed from northern Mali, made up a large portion of this army. When Gaddafi was ejected from power, they returned to their homeland, sometimes forcibly, so as black Africans came under attack in post-Gaddafi Libya, an uncomfortable truth and fact largely ignored by the Western media. The Libyan war was seen as a success, and here we are engaging with its catastrophic blowback, Alex.
Yeah, I would agree that there is blowback from Libya. I would say that the Libyan campaign as a humanitarian operation to stop massacre of civilians in Benghazi was a success if you define it narrowly as such. The trouble was that there was Western ambition to turn a responsibility to protect civilian protection operation into something that became a regime change effort. And it's absolutely true that the collapse of the Gaddafi administration resulted in porous arsenals and of Tuareg groups and others that were able to rearm and have military experience that they took back into Mali. The core roots of the Mali crisis, though, are ones of disenfranchisement, of poverty, of the collapse of previous peace agreements, including the Peace of Timbuktu in 1996. So it's been exaggerated, but at the core of it is a Malian crisis related to the legitimacy of the Malian state in the north of Mali. And so what we have here is a multi-layered crisis, which includes blowback from Libya, but there was already a crisis in northern Libya, in northern Mali before the Libyan crisis, and in fact Western governments and others had already been building up their intelligence and expertise on Mali in anticipation that this was going to be a deteriorating situation.